start off, this is just the documented evidence of recorded history of European madness. Not since the beginning of mankind have there ever been such wickedness performed by another race of humans upon another race of people. Then hidden in lies, deception. 90% of the history these people have written about themselves is a lie or half-truths or just downright deception. Their history is stolen identities, stolen wealth, stolen land, genocide, rape, slavery. Their true story reads like a psychopathic, insane people out of control. Go look at any history book, they water down their murderous rampages. Throughout history, they commit these crimes against the peoples of these lands and then call the people savages. That's how sick they are. History shows the worst savages this earth has seen is the European. This will be a 7-part series covering the European madness that has swept over this earth. This first part will focus on where did they come from and their true history. The Caucasian race, also Caucasoid, a Europid or Europoid. The Caucasus Mountains is a mountain range at the intersection of Asia and Europe. Stretching between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, they are surrounded by the Caucasus region and are home to Mount Elbrus, the highest peak in Europe at 5,642 meters, 18,510 feet above sea level. The Caucasus Mountains include the Greater Caucasus in the north and the Lesser Caucasus in the south. The Greater Caucasus runs west-northwest to east-southeast, from the Western Caucasus on the northeastern shore of the Black Sea to close to Baku on the Caspian Sea in Azerbaijan. The Lesser Caucasus runs parallel to the Greater about 100 kilometers, 62 miles south. 2. The Greater and Lesser Caucasus ranges are connected by the Liki Range, and to the west and east of the Liki Range lie the Colchis Plain and the Kura-Araz lowland respectively. The Meskheti Range is a part of the Lesser Caucasus system. In the southeast, the Aras River separates the Lesser Caucasus from the Talish Mountains, which runs through the Greater Azerbaijan region. The Lesser Caucasus and the Armenian Highland constitute the Transcaucasian Highland, which at their western end converges with the highland plateau of eastern Anatolia. Because of all the lies they created about themselves and where they came from, this is as close as we can get to their true region. What we do know is they come the mountains of a very cold region. The original white human had blonde hair and blue eyes until they started spreading and raping and destroying everything in their path. That's with today they have all these different color eyes. If they are not blonde hair and blue eyes, they are mixed with the African race. The fact in that most of the Europeans are brainwashed by the lies their forefathers told, and in these lying history books. Let's start with America and Columbus. Christopher Columbus was a murderer, tyrant, and scoundrel. Every year, many schools and businesses across the country close on the second Monday in October to celebrate the Italian Christopher Columbus's arrival in what are now called the Americas on October 12, 1942, or the discovery of America. Of course, Native Americans were already here, and Columbus, while remembered as a hero by many, was brutal to the native people. In his quest to find gold, he enslaved them, working thousands to death, brutalized them, and murdered them. The native population was nearly wiped out. In A People's History of the United States, Howard Zinn writes, "In 2 years, through murder, mutilation, or suicide, half of the 250,000 Indians on Haiti were dead." Columbus's efforts amounted to genocide. Native people were worked at a ferocious pace and died by the thousands, Zinn writes. By the year 1515, there were perhaps 50,000 Indians left. By 1550, there were 500. A report of the year 1650 shows none of the original Arawaks on the Bahamas or their descendants left on the island. Native Americans in what is now the United States would continue to be killed by later settlers in enormous numbers, have their land stolen by the government, and see their rights trampled on. This is Columbus's legacy, and the effects of his violent campaign and the decades of oppression afterward can still be seen today in the huge disparities between the Native American population and the population in general. A homicidal tyrant who initiated the 2 greatest crimes in the history of the Western Hemisphere, the Atlantic slave trade and the American Indian genocide. Rehashing all of his crimes would require a much longer article. Here is just a few. Columbus kidnapped a Carib woman and gave her to a crew member to rape. Bergreen quotes Michel de Cuneo, who participated in Columbus's second expedition to the Americas. While I was in the boat, I captured a very beautiful woman, whom the Lord Admiral Columbus gave to me. When I had taken her to my cabin, she was naked, as was their custom. I was filled with a desire to take my pleasure with her and attempted to satisfy my desire. She was unwilling, and so treated me with her nails that I wished I had never begun. I then took a piece of rope and whipped her soundly, and she let forth such incredible screams that you would not have believed your ears. Eventually we came to such terms, I assure you, that you would have thought she had been brought up in a school for whores. About 50,000 Indians committed mass suicide rather than comply with the span. The Indians destroyed their stores of bread so that neither they nor the invaders would be able to eat it. They plunged off cliffs, they poisoned themselves with roots, and they starved themselves to death. Oppressed by the impossible requirement to deliver tributes of gold, the Indians were no longer able to tend their fields or care for their sick, children, and elderly. They had given up and committed mass suicide to avoid being killed or captured by Christians, and to avoid sharing their land with them, their fields, groves, beaches, forests, and women, the future of their people. 56 years after Columbus's first voyage, only 500 out of 300,000 Indians remained on Hispaniola. Population figures from 500 years ago are necessarily imprecise, but Bergreen estimates that there were about 300,000 inhabitants of Hispaniola in 1492. Between 1494 and 1496, 100,000 died, half due to mass suicide. In 1508, the population was down to 60,000. By 1548, it was estimated to be only 500. From the time Europeans arrived on American shores, the frontier, the edge territory between white man's civilization and the untamed natural world, became a shared space of vast, clashing differences that led the U.S. government to authorize over 1,500 wars, attacks, and raids on Indians, the most of any country in the world against its indigenous people. By the close of the Indian Wars in the late 19th century, fewer than 238,000 indigenous people remained, a sharp decline from the estimated 5 million to 15 million living in North America when Columbus arrived in 1492. His reasons for this racial genocide were multi-layered. Settlers, most of whom had been barred from inheriting property in Europe, arrived on American shores hungry for Indian land and the abundant natural resources that came with it. Indians' collusion with the British during the American Revolution and the War of 1812 exacerbated American hostility and suspicion toward them. Even more fundamentally, indigenous people were just too different. Their skin was dark, their languages were foreign, and their worldviews and spiritual beliefs were beyond most white men's comprehension. To settlers fearful that a loved one might become the next Mary Campbell, all this stoked racial hatred and paranoia, making it easy to paint indigenous peoples as pagan savages who must be killed in the name of civilization and Christianity. Below, some of the most aggressive acts of genocide taken against indigenous Americans. The Gnadenhutten Massacre. In 1782, a group of militiamen from Pennsylvania killed 96 Christianized Delaware Indians, illustrating the growing contempt for native people. Captain David Williamson ordered the converted Delawares, who had been blamed for attacks on white settlements, to go to the cooper shop 2 at a time, where militiamen beat them to death with wooden mallets and hatchets. Ironically, the Delawares were the first Native Americans to capture a white settler and the first to sign a U.S. Indian treaty 4 years earlier, one that set the precedent for 374 treaties over the next 100 years. Often employing the common phrase peace and friendship, 229 of these agreements led to tribal lands being ceded to a rapidly expanding United States. Many treaties negotiated U.S.-Indian trade relations, establishing a trading system to oust the British and their goods, especially the guns they put in Indian hands. The Creek War. In the South, the War of 1812 bled into the Muskok Creek War of 1813-1814, also known as the Red Stick War. An intertribal conflict among Creek Indian factions, the war also engaged U.S. militias, along with the British and Spanish, who backed the Indians to help keep Americans from encroaching on their interests. Early Creek victories inspired General Andrew Jackson to retaliate with 2,500 men, mostly Tennessee militia, in early November 1814. To avenge the Creek-led massacre at Fort Mims, Jackson and his men slaughtered 186 Creeks at Tallushatchee. "We shot them like dogs," said Davy Crockett. In desperation, Muskoke Creek women killed their children so they would not see the soldiers butcher them. As one woman started to kill her baby, the famed Indian fighter, Andrew Jackson, grabbed the child from the mother. Later, he delivered the Indian baby to his wife, Rachel, for both of them to raise as their own. Jackson went on to win the Red Stick War in a decisive battle at Horseshoe Bend. The subsequent treaty required the Creek to cede more than 21 million acres of land to the United States. Forced removal. One of the most bitterly debated issues on the floor of Congress was the Indian Removal Bill of 1830, pushed hard by then-President Andrew Jackson. Despite being assailed by many legislators as immoral, the bill finally passed in the Senate by 9 votes, 29 to 17, and by an even smaller margin in the House. In Jackson's thinking, more than 36 Eastern tribes stood in the way of what he saw as the settlers' divinely ordained rights to clear the wilderness, build homes, and grow cotton and other crops. In his annual address to Congress in 1833, Jackson denounced Indians, stating, "They have neither the intelligence, the industry, the moral habits, nor the desire of improvement which are essential to any favorable change in their condition. Established in the midst of another and a superior race, they must necessarily yield to the force of circumstances and ere before long disappear." From 1830 to 1840, the U.S. Army removed 60,000 Indians, Choctaw, Creek, Cherokee, and others, from the east in exchange for new territory west of the Mississippi. Thousands died along the way of what became known as the Trail of Tears, and as whites pushed ever westward, the Indian-designated territory continued to shrink. The Scalp Act. Scalping is the act of cutting or tearing a part of the human scalp, with hair attached, from the head. This gruesome procedure generally occurred during warfare, with the scalp being taken as a macabre trophy. Scalp taking is considered part of the broader cultural practice of the taking and display of human body parts as trophies, a sign of dominance and a testament to the combatant's prowess in battle. It may have developed as an alternative to the taking of whole human heads, which were more difficult to acquire, transport, and preserve for subsequent display. Scalping developed independently in various cultures across the world. Indeed, it was practiced by some indigenous peoples as an award of triumph in battle. Eventually, scalping also became financially motivated, with individuals receiving payment for each scalp procured. New Hampshire militiamen partook in the first recorded scalping of Indians by whites in North America, as 10 sleeping Indians were scalped by whites for a bounty. Making it an official government policy, one that enabled individual citizens to be paid by the state of Pennsylvania for every scalp taken, was new. It's not entirely clear where or when a bounty for scalps was first offered, but it wasn't all that rare in New England by the early 1700s. In fact, most Americans seem to have accepted the validity of the practice at the time. In April of 1756, Pennsylvania Lieutenant Governor Robert Morris enacted the Scalp Act. Anyone who brought in a male scalp above age of 12 would be given 150 pieces of 8, or the equivalent of $150. For females above age of 12, or males under the age of 12, they would be paid $130. The scalp of an Indian woman earned a payment of $50. The military effectiveness of a scalp bounty wasn't tabulated based on the number of actual scalps. The mere announcement of a bounty transformed the settlers from passive observers to active participants. The bounty system in America was initiated by the Dutch and elaborated by New Englanders. It first offered payment in exchange for the heads of wolves and other predatory animals that were an undesirable obstacle to orderly settlement. It wasn't that much of a stretch, therefore, when even greater rewards were offered for the collection of Indian scalps. Legislators made explicit the similarity they saw between these animal and human predators by using the same terms of evidence for a kill, the head or the scalp. Bounties made Indians into predatory animals whose terrifying attacks on outlying settlements reduced English families to prey. The implication that such attacks would undermine English colonization suggested Indians should be treated like any other predator the settlers had encountered. By equating Indian scalps with animal skins, bounties also increased settlers' distance from their native neighbors and dehumanized them. Indians were now objects whose body parts could be bought and sold. Reducing humans to commodities replicated the slave trade, and many colonial bounty acts outlined rewards for prisoners as well as scalps. New England's bounties encouraged indiscriminate Indian hunting and hating. Look at how they lie. Every cowboy and Indian show you ever seen. They said the Indians were doing the scalping. See how they lie and twist everything. They are liars and broke every treaty with the Indians. They're sick. Indians were now objects whose body parts could be bought and sold. Just another government policy. This is the sick, twisted, murderous European, the scourge of the earth, and today's Europeans have no shame about their psychotic forefathers. It's like knowing your dad is Hitler or Jeffrey Dahmer or any other mass murderer, and you're good with it. I tell no lies here. Go do the research for yourself. Europeans are some sick people. History shows us that. Stay tuned for part 2, the Atlantic slave trade.